4 miles under the Pacific, a warship sits in total darkness, crushed by cold and weight, still holding the guns it fired in 1944. Down there we will meet a ship that attacked a fleet 10 times its size, worms that eat entire wooden vessels, and steel so rare that thieves are stealing it from graves. If this kind of thing grips you, drop a like and subscribe so more of it finds you. Take one deep breath. We are going down. In June of 2022, a metal ball about the size of a minivan slipped under the waves near the Philippines and started falling. A man named Victor Vescovo sat inside it, folded into a seat with his knees near his chest. The window in front of his face was a thick cone of plastic. The fall took hours. There is nothing to do during a fall like that except watch the depth climb and listen to the hull tick and groan as the ocean leans on it. At half a mile, the last of the blue light died. Total black. At 1 mile, the water outside chilled to a few degrees above freezing. At 4 miles, the pressure reached about 10,000 pounds on every square inch of the sphere. Picture a pickup truck balanced on your thumbnail. Now picture that everywhere, all at once, on every part of you, forever. Vescovo was hunting a ghost. Somewhere in the mud below him lay a small American warship called the Samuel B. Roberts, lost since 1944. Sailors called her the Sammy B. Nobody had seen her in almost 80 years, and nobody knew exactly where she went down, because the men who watched her sink were busy trying to survive. The sonar found a smudge, a shape on the flat floor where the floor should be empty. Vescovo steered toward it and switched on the lights. And there she was. Guns still bolted to the deck, some of them still loaded. The bow sat almost proud, buckled where it punched into the seabed, and the stern lay broken off behind it. Paint clung to the metal. At this depth there is barely enough oxygen for rust or slime to do their work, so the wreck looks a lot like it did on the day it died. The ocean did the strangest thing you can do to a violent moment. It froze it. Then the team checked the number. 22,916 feet. 4 1/3 miles straight down. That number made her the deepest shipwreck ever found on Earth, and the record still stands today. To picture it, stack 15 Empire State Buildings on top of each other and sink the whole tower. There would still be water above the highest antenna. Almost the entire ocean is shallower than this spot. The Sammy B did not simply sink. She fell into one of the emptiest places our planet has. Here is the part that surprises people. You cannot go visit her. The exact coordinates are locked away. Vescovo will not publish them, and the United States Navy will not either. 89 men went down with that ship. The wreck is their grave, and graves get protected, even ones nobody can reach. Deep water used to protect itself. Now robots and private submarines are cheap enough that a rich crew with a grudge or a shopping list can go poke at almost anything, and some wrecks have already been chopped apart for scrap. So the location stays dark on purpose, which leaves one question sitting in the mud with her. How does a tiny escort ship, built to babysit slow supply convoys, end up 4 miles under the Pacific with her guns loaded and her hull torn open by battleship shells? Because the Sammy B was never supposed to fight anything. On the morning she died, she saw 23 Japanese warships come over the horizon, and she turned toward them. The sun came up on October 25th, 1944, and the men on the Sammy B thought it would be a boring day. Their job was babysitting. 6 small aircraft carriers sat nearby, slow and thin-skinned, built to fly planes over the beach while American troops fought their way back into the Philippines. The whole little group had a nickname that tells you how seriously anyone took it. Taffy 3. Then a lookout saw shapes on the horizon. 23 Japanese warships, 4 battleships, cruisers, destroyers. In the middle of it sat the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with guns that could throw a shell the weight of a small car for 20 miles. The Japanese fleet had slipped through the night to gut the invasion, and the only thing standing in front of it was a handful of ships with popgun cannons and no armour at all. The math was not close. The Sammy B weighed about as much as the Yamato's front turret. Her captain, Robert Copeland, got on the loudspeaker. He told his crew they were heading into a fight nobody survives, and that they were going to give the enemy everything they had while they still could. Then he turned his ship toward the biggest navy on the ocean and pushed the throttles forward. What happened next is the reason people still argue about this battle. The Sammy B ran straight at a heavy cruiser called the Chikuma, a ship 10 times her size. She fired torpedoes into it. She got so close that her little guns could not miss, and so close that the cruiser's big guns could not aim low enough to hit her. She fired over 600 shells. She burned through her ammunition until the racks were empty, then loaded practice rounds, then loaded star shells, the flares meant for lighting up the sea at night, and shot those at a warship because there was nothing else left. The Chikuma was wrecked. So was the Sammy B battleship shells found her around 9 in the morning. One tore through her side and opened her up like a can. Another blew the stern nearly off. The engines died. She sat still on flat water while more shells came in, and then she rolled and went under, and the Pacific took her down more than 4 miles into the dark. Copeland lived. So did about 120 of his men. They clung to rafts and floating junk for 50 hours while the sun cooked them and sharks worked the edges of the group. 89 of their shipmates were already gone. Here is the strange ending. The Japanese admiral looked at the smoke, the torpedo wakes, the ships charging at him from every angle, and decided he had run into something far larger than a few escorts. He turned around. He sailed away from the invasion he had come to destroy. A group of ships that should have been erased in 20 minutes bluffed the strongest fleet in the world into retreating. Historians later gave the Sammy B a name that stuck: the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. She was one of 4 ships lost that morning, and every one of them dropped into the same deep water, which means she has neighbours down there. One of them charged first, took the worst of it, and sat undiscovered for so long that people started to believe the ocean had swallowed her whole. When a camera finally found her, the crew on the surface could not prove what they were looking at, until somebody spotted 3 numbers painted on a wall of steel. The Johnston went in alone. Her captain, Ernest Evans, did not wait for orders that morning. He saw the Japanese fleet, turned his destroyer toward it, and told the helmsman to go. His ship laid smoke to hide the carriers, fired every torpedo she had, and blew the bow off a heavy cruiser. Then the shells came back. Sailors on other ships watched the Johnston get taken apart piece by piece. 1 engine gone, half her guns gone, her bridge shredded. Evans kept fighting from the back deck, shouting steering orders down an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand. When a squadron of Japanese destroyers came in to launch torpedoes at the carriers, the Johnston, already dying, turned and charged them too. They broke off and ran. She went down around 10 in the morning. 187 men died, Evans among them. A Japanese officer on a passing destroyer reportedly stood at attention and saluted her as she sank. Then she vanished for 75 years. In 2019, a research ship named the Petrel swept the seabed with sonar and found metal. Cameras went down and came back with pictures of a gun, a piece of a shaft, some scattered wreckage. Everyone wanted it to be the Johnston. Nobody could prove it, because the pieces they could reach had no name on them, and the sonar showed something much bigger, lying deeper, past the limit of their robot. That is where the story stalls. The evidence was sitting a little farther down than technology could go. In March of 2021, a 2-person submarine went after it. The dives lasted about 8 hours each. Down at the bottom of the search, the lights swept across a wall of steel standing upright in the mud, and there they were. 5, 5, 7. Painted numbers, still legible, still holding their shape after 3/4 of a century in the black. Hull number 557. The Johnston. The wreck sat 2/3 intact. Gun turrets in place. The bridge structure recognisable. Twin propellers still attached to their shafts, ready to turn. The damage covering her was the damage from that morning, torn edges and shell holes, because the ocean down there is too cold and too starved of oxygen to do much of its own wrecking. The depth reading came back at 21,180 feet. 4 miles. For a year, that made her the deepest shipwreck ever found by anyone, and the deepest wreck a human being had ever visited in person. Think about where she landed. She fell into the Philippine Trench, a crack in the planet so deep that if you dropped Mount Everest into the deepest part, the peak would still be about a mile underwater. The Johnston did not even reach the bottom of it. She stopped on a ledge partway down. Her wreck is a war grave, so the team touched nothing, took nothing, and gave every scan and every photograph to the United States Navy for free. Then, 13 months later, the same explorer went back to the same battlefield, found the Sammy B 400 yards deeper and took the record away from her. Both of those dives depended on one machine, a machine that had to survive a place where the ocean is trying to close its fist. It weighed as much as 3 pickup trucks, cost more than a mansion, and the part that kept people alive was the size of a walk-in closet. The sub looks wrong the first time you see it. Most submarines are long tubes, the shape you picture from movies. This one is a fat lozenge of white foam and metal, about 15 feet long, hanging off a crane like a piece of playground equipment. The name painted on the side is the limiting factor. Nothing about it is playground equipment. Buried inside, all that foam is the only part that matters. A hollow ball of titanium 5 feet across on the inside with walls about 3.5 inches thick. 2 people fold themselves into it through a hatch and sit knee to knee. There is no standing. There is no walking around. There is a seat, a few screens, 3 small windows and a sphere. The shape is the whole trick. Push on a flat wall and the middle bends. Push on a ball and the force has nowhere to concentrate, because every square inch is pressing against every other square inch. A ball spreads a squeeze around itself the way an arch spreads the weight of a bridge into the ground. That is why the crew ball is a ball, and why the rest of the sub is basically packaging. The titanium sphere took years to get right. The metal had to be forged in 2 halves and machined so precisely that when the halves met, the seam would hold under a load that could flatten a bank vault. The engineers tested the design in a pressure chamber until they were sure. The man who paid for it, Victor Vescovo, sold a chunk of his life savings to make it exist, then used it to become the first person to reach the deepest point of all 5 oceans. A few weeks before he found the Sammy B, he also flew to space on a rocket. He is that kind of person. Here is what a dive actually feels like. You climb in before sunrise, the hatch closes, the crane drops you in the water, and the surface team peels away, and then the sub simply falls. No engine, no diving. It carries heavy steel weights and sinks the way a stone sinks, roughly 100 feet every minute. 4 miles takes about 4 hours of doing nothing while the temperature in the cabin drops and your breath starts to fog. The hull groans as it compresses, metal ticks and pops. Vescovo says you learn to like the sounds because a quiet hull would mean something worse. At the bottom, thrusters wake up and the lights come on, and you can see maybe 100 feet ahead. Everything outside that circle is nothing. To come home, the sub drops the steel weights and floats back up on foam. If the electronics all die at once, the weights release on their own, because the whole machine is designed around one assumption. Something will fail eventually, and you should still go up. There is no rescue, there is no calling for help. No other vehicle on Earth can come get you at that depth, and the ocean above you weighs more than anything a human body has words for. People throw around the number without feeling it. 10,000 pounds pressing on every square inch. So let us stop being polite about that number. Let us find out what happens to a coffee cup, a steel warship, and a person when the ocean actually leans in. Take a foam cup, the cheap kind from a gas station. Draw a face on it with a marker. Tie it to the outside of the sub in a mesh bag and send it to the bottom. It comes back the size of a thimble. The face is still there, shrunk and wrinkled, staring at you. The foam was mostly tiny air bubbles, and the ocean pressed every one of them flat. Crews do this on every deep dive. It is a party trick, and it is also the clearest lesson in ocean physics you will ever hold in your hand. Air is the enemy down there. Anything solid, anything already full of water, barely notices the squeeze. Your bones do not care, your muscles do not care. Water refuses to compress, so a body made mostly of water can take more than you would guess. The trouble is the spaces, your lungs, your sinuses, your ear canals, your gut. Send an unprotected human to 23,000 feet, and those spaces collapse first. The chest caves inward. Air gets crushed into a volume smaller than a golf ball. It happens faster than a thought, and the person is gone before the nervous system finishes reporting it. There is a small mercy in the speed. Now scale it up. A warship is a floating box of air pockets, engine rooms, fuel tanks, compartments sealed by frightened men trying to keep the sea out. When that ship starts falling, every sealed space becomes a bomb waiting to go off inward. Somewhere in the first mile, the weakest bulkhead lets go with a bang, and the crushing runs through the hull like a zipper. This is why deep wrecks look shredded even when nothing hit them. The Titanic hit an iceberg on one side, and yet her whole midsection is a chewed mess because the ship broke in half at the surface and then imploded on the way down. Steel plates peeled, decks pancaked. She was still being destroyed for 2.5 miles after everyone on the surface stopped watching. Engineers have a word for a hull failing this way: implosion. It takes about 1,000th of a second, and the water rushing in reaches speeds of hundreds of miles an hour. When submarines are lost, the sound of that moment shows up on distant listening stations as a single sharp crack, and that crack is sometimes the only record of how a crew died. So imagine what falls onto the seabed after a battle like Samar. Not a ship in the tidy shape you saw in the harbour, a ship that was hit, then flooded, then crushed, then dropped 4 miles through the dark, tumbling and shedding pieces the whole way. Helmets, shells, boots, radios, everything spilling out of the hull and drifting down slower than the steel, spreading across the mud in a long trail like sand poured out of a truck. Wreck hunters use that trail. The heavy stuff lands close. The light stuff drifts for a mile. Find the trail, follow it uphill, and it points at the body. By every rule you just learned, a ship like that should be a smear of junk when you finally reach it. The Sammy B is not a smear of junk. Her paint is still on. Her guns are still loaded. She looks like the 1940s down there, because the same ocean that destroys ships on the way down is also the best preservation machine on the planet, and the deeper you go, the better it works. The Johnston has a coffee cup on her deck, not a foam one. A white ceramic mug sitting where somebody left it 4 miles down, in a place that has been trying to erase her since Franklin Roosevelt was president. It survived because down there, almost nothing wants to eat, rust, or grow. Rot is a chemistry problem, and the abyss shuts the chemistry down. Start with cold. The water sits around 35 degrees, barely above freezing, all day, all year, forever. Every chemical reaction slows in the cold. That is why you keep milk in the fridge instead of on the counter. The deep ocean is a fridge with no door and no power bill, and it has been running for millions of years. Then take away oxygen. Rust is iron marrying oxygen. Deep water in these trenches carries very little of it, because there are no plants making it, and almost no bubbles reaching down. Vescovo put it plainly after his dives. There is so little oxygen, and so little life growing on the wrecks that they can look much, the way they did when they were fighting, then kill the light. No light means no algae, no seaweed, no green fuzz. On a wreck in the Caribbean, coral and sponges swallow the hull in a decade or two. On these wrecks, the steel stays bare. Then remove the weather. There are no waves at 4 miles. No storms, no tides ripping at the structure, no sand blasting the paint. The water barely moves. A ship down there is being held gently in the dark. Put those 4 together and you get something eerie. A wreck that stops being a wreck and starts being a photograph. The proof is in what the cameras find. Numbers still readable on the Johnston's hull. Live ammunition still in the Sammy B's racks. Portholes with glass still in them. A ladder somebody climbed on the last morning of their life, still bolted where it always was. Historians love this, because it turns a wreck into evidence. When a team scanned the Johnston and built a 3-dimensional model, they could read her wounds like a crime scene. Which shells hit where? Which explosions came from inside? Which damage killed her? Survivors told that story 80 years ago from memory in shock, while sharks circled them. Now the steel tells the same story with dates and angles. So the deep is the best museum we have. It is also the most useless museum we have because 98% of the ocean is shallower than the Sammy B, and almost every wreck humans care about is sitting somewhere warmer, brighter, and hungrier. Which brings us to the most famous ship on Earth. The Titanic sits 2.5 miles down, cold, dark, quiet. By everything you just read, she should be perfect down there. She should be a photograph too. She's falling apart instead. Her crow's nest is gone. Her railings have started to collapse. Some scientists think she has fewer than 20 years left as a recognizable ship, and then the North Atlantic will have nothing but a rust stain and a pair of engines. Something is eating her. Something alive. And the man who found her in 1985 was not really looking for her at all. He was on a secret mission for the United States Navy, hunting 2 lost nuclear submarines, and the Titanic was the cover story he used to hide it. The deal Robert Ballard made in 1982 was simple. The Navy would give him the money and the ship. In return, he had to find 2 dead submarines first. Ballard wanted the Titanic. He had wanted it for years, and nobody would fund him, because hunting a rusty cruise liner is not a national priority. So he went to the United States Navy and asked. The Navy said yes, with a catch that stayed secret for the next 23 years. 2 American nuclear submarines were lying on the Atlantic floor. The Thresher went down in 1963 with 129 men aboard. The Scorpion went down in 1968 with 99. Both were carrying nuclear reactors. The Scorpion was carrying nuclear weapons too, and it was still down there, quietly leaking who knows what into the water. The Navy needed to know what was happening to those reactors, and it needed nobody watching while it looked. That is where Ballard came in. He would take his robot cameras out, map both submarines, hand over the data, and then use whatever days he had left for anything he liked. Cover stories work best when they are true. Ballard really did want the Titanic. The world really did think that was the whole mission. Nobody thought twice about a scientist poking around the North Atlantic, and the Soviets never asked a single question. Then something happened that turned the errand into the discovery. Crawling over the Scorpion's remains, Ballard noticed the shape of the mess. A sunken ship does not land in a heap. It sheds pieces on the way down, and the light stuff drifts sideways in the current while the heavy stuff drops straight. The wreckage spreads out across the mud in a long tail, like the tail of a comet, sometimes for more than a mile. Everyone hunting the Titanic had been looking for a ship. Ballard realised he should look for the trash. By the time he got his shot in the summer of 1985, he had 12 days. 12 days to search a patch of ocean bigger than a city, 2.5 miles down, using a camera sled dragged on a cable at the speed of a slow walk. Every previous expedition had failed. The odds were awful. He did not sweep for a hull. He mowed the seabed in long lines, watching for junk, betting that the debris tail would be wider than the ship and easier to cross. At about 1 in the morning on the 1st of September, the crew in the control van were half asleep, staring at a screen full of nothing. Mud, mud, mud. Then a curve of riveted metal slid past the camera. A boiler, round, huge, unmistakably built by human hands, sitting alone on the bottom of the ocean. Somebody grabbed a book of old photographs and held it to the monitor. It matched the boilers from the Titanic's engine rooms exactly. The ship was a few hundred yards away, standing on the seabed with her bow pointed forward, still steaming toward New York in the dark. The party in that room lasted about 10 minutes. Ballard stopped it. Roughly 1,500 people had died right where they were standing, and he could feel the time on the clock. 20 minutes to 2 in the morning, almost exactly when she went under. The next day, the cameras came back with pictures of the hull. The steel was hanging with long orange icicles, thousands of them, drooping off every rail and rivet like something out of a cave. And they were alive. They named them rusticles, and touching one destroys it. Robots have tried. A manipulator arm brushes against one of those orange icicles, and the whole thing bursts into a cloud of powder that hangs in the water like dropped flour. They look solid. They have the strength of a cigarette ash. For years, nobody knew what they were. The guess was rust, dripping and hardening the way rust sometimes does on old bridges. The truth turned out to be much stranger. Scientists brought pieces up and put them under microscopes. Inside each icicle was a network of tunnels and channels, hollow, branching, running from the surface of the steel out to the tip. Water moved through them. Something had built plumbing. The builders were bacteria, not one kind either. Dozens of species, living packed together in a colony, each doing a different job in the same factory. Some pulled iron out of the hull, some handled the waste, some laid down the walls that held the whole structure up. The colony was farming the ship. In 2010, researchers pulled a new bacteria out of a rusticle sample and named it after the ship it was eating. It had never been seen anywhere else, a creature discovered inside its own meal. Here is the piece that resets your sense of scale. Iron looks like a rock to us. To these bacteria, iron is food. They strip electrons off the metal the way you strip energy out of a sandwich, and they have been eating the Titanic since 1912, every second in total darkness with no days off. The estimates for how fast are rough, and they are grim. Some researchers put it at several hundred pounds of iron every day. Some go higher. The colony grows where the steel is exposed and the water is moving, so the rails, the crane arms, and the open decks go first, and the buried, sheltered parts hang on longest. You can watch it happen across the photographs. Ballard's pictures from 1985 show a ship with sharp edges. The pictures from 20 years later show the same edges gone soft and shaggy, like a sweater left out in the rain. So why does the Titanic get devoured while the Johnston keeps her painted numbers 4 miles down? Depth is the answer, and the difference is brutal. The Titanic sits about 2.5 miles down. The Sammy B sits at 4 1/3. That extra stretch of water changes everything. The water around the Titanic still carries enough oxygen for the iron eaters to breathe, and enough drifting food to keep a whole ecosystem ticking. Down in the trench, the buffet is nearly empty. The bacteria are there, and they are hungry, and they are starving. They cannot build much. The Titanic landed in a place that looks dead and works like a compost heap, which is why the numbers coming out of every recent expedition point one direction. The crow's nest, the spot where a lookout screamed about an iceberg, is gone. Nothing there. The captain's quarters have collapsed. A railing that stood on the bow for over a century recently peeled off and dropped into the mud. Some scientists think the ship has a few decades left at most, before she folds into a stain on the seabed. The most famous wreck in history is on a countdown. Watch the same spot on the bow across 40 years of photographs and you can see the future arrive. 1985. A rail runs along the front of the ship straight and clean, the exact place 2 movie characters would later stand with their arms out. 2022. The rail is bowed and sagging. 2024. A long section of it is lying flat in the mud below, snapped off, half swallowed already. The Titanic is not being destroyed all at once. She is being subtracted. The crow's nest went first, decades ago. That was the little steel bucket where a lookout named Frederick Fleet stood in the freezing dark and rang a bell 3 times. The most important object on the ship in the most important minute of the ship's life, and there is nothing there now. Just the mast with a hole in it. The gymnasium roof caved in. The officers' quarters folded. The famous bathtub in the captain's bathroom, a favourite shot on every expedition for 20 years, is buried under a collapse. The deckhouse over the grand staircase is drooping like a tent with a broken pole. The reason is the same reason a house rots faster than a rock. The steel is being eaten by bacteria, and eaten steel gets thin, and thin steel cannot hold up a 9-story building. Every ton the colonies pull out of a deck makes the deck below more likely to pancake. Once one level goes, the level under it takes the hit. Collapse feeds collapse. Predictions run from a couple of decades to about 80 years for a recognisable ship. Everybody arguing about the range agrees on the ending. The Titanic will finish as a rust stain, a boiler field, and 2 enormous engines standing in the mud, because engines are solid, and there is too much metal there for anything to chew through quickly. Visiting her has gotten harder for a much heavier reason. In June of 2023, a small private submersible carrying 5 people set off for the wreck. Its hull was built out of carbon fibre and titanium, a design nobody had used at that depth before. Contact was lost about 1 hour and 45 minutes into the dive. Listening equipment picked up a sound, and the Coast Guard later confirmed the vehicle had imploded. Everyone aboard died instantly. In the way you learned about earlier, faster than nerves can carry a signal. The pieces landed near the Titanic's bow. That loss changed the mood around deep diving. The sub had skipped the outside safety checks that other builders treat as the price of entry. Every serious operator in the industry runs its hulls through certification and pressure testing, over and over, because the ocean does not care how confident you are. So the ship keeps sinking into herself, and the visits are rarer, and the photographs keep getting sadder, which raises a question that sounds unfair. Why does the Titanic get eaten alive in the cold and the dark, while other wrecks in cold, dark water look almost untouched? Because the North Atlantic is a busy place, and there are corners of this planet that are much emptier. There is a wooden sailing ship at the bottom of the Antarctic right now. Wood, rope, timbers. She was crushed by ice in 1915 and sank while her crew watched from the floe. When a robot found her, the name was still readable on the stern, and the whole ship was standing upright, like she was waiting for the tide. The Endurance died slowly, and everybody watched. Ernest Shackleton sailed her toward Antarctica in 1914, planning to cross the continent on foot. He never landed. The Weddell Sea froze around his ship and the ice took hold, and for 10 months the Endurance sat trapped while the floe carried her wherever it wanted. Then the ice started squeezing. His men could hear it. The timbers groaned all night. Beams the thickness of a man's body cracked like gunshots. Water came in faster than the pumps could push it out. In October of 1915, Shackleton gave up and ordered everyone onto the ice with whatever they could drag. 3 weeks later, the ship went down through a hole in the floe, stern first, and the sea closed over her. What Shackleton did next is why anyone remembers him. He got 27 men across ice, then open water, then an 800-mile crossing in a lifeboat the size of a pickup truck, then a mountain range nobody had ever crossed. Every single one of them lived. The ship stayed lost for 107 years. Finding her looked hopeless. The Weddell Sea is jammed with pack ice most of the year. The currents drag everything sideways, and there was no satellite, no radar, nothing. All anyone had was the arithmetic of a man named Frank Worsley, who had stood on a shifting floe with a sextant and worked out where he was using the sun. In 2022, an expedition sailed into the ice with Worsley's numbers and a robot. They searched a box around his position. Weather nearly ended the trip twice. 4 miles down and a little more, the sonar found a shape with straight lines. The pictures came back and people at the surface started crying. She's standing upright on the seabed, sitting level, 10,000 feet down. The masts are broken, the rigging is scattered, and everything else is exactly where the crew left it. Portholes with glass, a ship's wheel, boots, plates, a signal pistol lying on the deck. The wooden planking is still smooth, and across the stern under a carved star you can read 7 letters. Endurance, wood, in the ocean, for over a century. That should be impossible. Anywhere else, a wooden ship gets eaten to nothing in a decade or two. Timbers turn to lace, hulls slump into a pile of nails and cargo. The Mediterranean does it. The Caribbean does it fast. The North Sea does it. Wood is food, and the ocean is full of things that know it. The Weddell Sea is the exception, and the reason sounds like a riddle. That water is so far from any coast and so locked in ice that almost no wood ever gets there. No forests, no rivers carrying logs, no driftwood, nothing. The creatures that specialize in eating sunken timber cannot live in a place with nothing to eat. They never colonized it. Their larvae drift in, find a desert, and die. So Shackleton's ship landed in the one patch of ocean where the wood-eaters had already starved out, and the cold did the rest. Everywhere else, they're waiting. The main one looks like a worm and works like a drill, and it has sunk more ships than every navy in history combined. Sailors called it the termite of the sea, and they were being polite. Pull a plank out of a wooden shipwreck in warm water, and it looks fine from the outside. A little worn, solid enough. Then you turn it over and the inside is a honeycomb of tunnels, hundreds of them, smooth and round and packed side by side, and the whole thing weighs nothing. You can crush it in your fist. The animal that did it looks like a pale worm, thin as a shoelace, sometimes a foot long. It is actually a clam that gave up on having a shell big enough to live in and turned the shell into a tool instead. Here is how it works. 2 tiny plates sit on the front end, ridged like files. The animal presses them against the wood and rocks them back and forth thousands of times, grinding a tunnel deeper into the timber. It swallows the shavings. Bacteria in its gut break the wood down into sugar, which means this creature does the one thing almost no animal can manage. It digests a tree. The tunnel gets longer as the animal grows. It never turns around. It never leaves. Two little tubes stay behind at the entry hole, poking into the water to breathe, and the hole itself is the width of a pencil lead. From outside, a ruined hull shows a few pinpricks. Now count them. A single plank can hold hundreds. A hull can hold millions. Sailors in the 1600s hauled ships up on beaches and found planks so tunneled that a knife blade would push straight through. This is why the wooden world had a clock on it. Christopher Columbus learned that the hard way. On his fourth voyage in 1503, his ships got so chewed up by these animals that the pumps could not keep up, and he ran the whole fleet aground on Jamaica to stop them from sinking. He was stranded there for a year. The Spanish Empire's grip on the New World was, at that moment, defeated by a clam. Navies fought back for 200 years. They burned tar into hulls. They nailed thin sheets of lead on. They tried felt, hair, and pitch. In the 1700s, the British started sheathing warships in copper, and it worked, because copper leaks a little poison into the water, and the larvae will not settle on it. Ships got faster and lasted longer. Fleets started winning battles because of a clam nobody could see. The Dutch nearly lost their country to it. In the 1730s, the animals got into the wooden pilings holding up the seawalls that keep the North Sea out of the Netherlands. The pilings hollowed. Panic followed. They rebuilt in stone. So here is the rule for wooden wrecks. Warm water, shallow water, and normal salty ocean means a ship has about 10 or 20 years before it becomes a pile of cargo with some nails in it. Cold water, or water with too little salt like the Baltic, slows the animals down, and ships survive for centuries. And Antarctica, with no wood at all, keeps a ship like the Endurance looking almost new, which leaves the deep ocean, cold, dark and starved. Except the deep has its own version of this animal, a specialist, smaller and stranger, that survives in a place where a piece of wood shows up maybe once in a lifetime. Finding it takes a scientist willing to sink a pile of logs on purpose and come back years later to see what moved in. Somewhere on the ocean floor right now there is a tree, and it is the most crowded place for miles. Scientists put it there. The experiment is exactly as odd as it sounds. Take logs, tie them to weights, and drop them 3 miles down onto flat mud where nothing much happens. Come back later and see what showed up. The mud around the log is a desert. Almost nothing lives there, because almost nothing eats there. Then a log lands, and within months it is covered. The first arrivals are clams, cousins of the shipworm, shorter and fatter, built for a life nobody else wants. They drill into the wood, fill it with tunnels, and turn timber into sugar with help from bacteria in their guts. Their waste feeds a second wave. Snails move in, worms move in, shrimp show up to graze, a dead tree becomes a town, and every one of those animals faces an impossible problem. Their food does not exist. Wood is a thing that grows on land. To reach the deep ocean, it has to fall in a river, survive the trip to the coast, get waterlogged enough to sink, drift out past the shelf, and land somewhere in the dark. It is a lottery ticket. The nearest log might be 500 miles away. It might be 500 years away. So the animals do the only thing that works. They breed like the world is ending, and they scatter their babies into the water as tiny drifting specks by the millions. Almost everyone dies. The ocean is enormous, and wood is rare and the odds are close to zero. A handful get lucky, sniff out a sunken piece of tree, land on it, and start drilling. Then the log runs out. It always runs out. The town starves. The survivors send another cloud of babies into the black, and the lottery starts again. That is the deep sea in one picture. A blank plain where life waits, sometimes for centuries, for a meal to fall out of the sky. Now put a shipwreck in the middle of that. A wooden ship is not a log. A wooden ship is 100 tons of dry oak, framed and planked and packed with rope and barrels, dropped into a place that starves for exactly that. It is the biggest thing that has ever happened to that patch of seabed. The clams find it. They always find it. Slower down there, because everything is slower in the cold, but they get there, and then they start eating a ship the way a mob eats a buffet. Which is why the arithmetic on old wooden wrecks is so ugly. Warm and shallow, a hull lasts years. Cold and deep, it lasts longer, maybe centuries, and it still ends the same way. The timber goes, the rope goes, everything organic goes. What survives is the junk the animals cannot chew, so a 500-year-old wreck should look like a shadow on the mud, with a few cannons and a spill of pottery to show that anything was ever there. That is what the textbooks say. In 2025, the French Navy was running a routine survey off the coast near Saint-Tropez, sweeping the seabed for nothing in particular. When the sonar painted a shape a mile and a half down, they sent a robot. It took an hour to fall. When the lights came on, there were 6 cannons in the mud and hundreds of jugs still stacked in rows, still bright blue and yellow, 5 centuries after the ship carrying them went under. The visibility was so good the archaeologists kept forgetting how deep they were. 8,200 feet. Over a mile and a half of black water sitting on top of the robot, and the camera feed looked like a swimming pool. No sediment stirring, no current. Just light sliding across the seabed and pottery everywhere. They call the site Camarat 4. It sits about 30 miles off Ramatuelle, near Saint-Tropez, and until a Navy survey stumbled onto it, nobody knew it was there. It is now the deepest shipwreck ever found in French waters, and it is over 500 years old. The robot that went down is the biggest one the French Navy has, rated to about 13,000 feet, with cameras and a pair of pincers on the front. It took a full hour just to reach the floor. Then it flew slow lines over the wreck, shooting 8 photographs every second for 3 hours, until it had collected more than 66,000 images. Stack those together, and you get a 3-dimensional model of the site, accurate enough that researchers on land can walk through the wreck without ever getting wet. What the model shows is a ship that died with her whole life still packed in the hold. 6 cannons, an anchor, 12 cauldrons, the big cooking kind, and spread out across the sand, a small building's worth of ceramics, round pitchers stacked in piles, plates in rows, jugs by the 100. The decoration is what stops people. After 500 years underwater, the glaze still holds its colour, bold blues and yellows, geometric patterns, flowers, crosses and fish painted by hand by somebody in northern Italy who never once imagined a machine looking at their work from a mile and a half down. One plate carries the first 3 Greek letters of the name of Jesus, and Mark Potters used the way a company uses a logo today. The style is the fingerprint. That kind of pottery came out of workshops in Liguria, in northern Italy, in the 1500s. So this was a merchant ship loaded with dishes and metal bars heading somewhere along the coast to sell them. Where she was going, nobody knows. Why she sank, nobody knows. There was no battle here. She simply went down in deep water, and the deep water kept her. Now go back to the last chapter and remember what should have happened to a wooden hull. The clams should have eaten it. And they did. The ship itself is basically gone. What is lying on the seabed is the cargo, sitting in the shape of the hold that used to hold it, like a body outline drawn in dishes. The robot brought up 3 pitchers and a plate. It grabbed them with pincers, gently, from a spot the government will not put on a map. France keeps the coordinates secret for the same reason the Navy hides the Sammy B. A site this rich, this shallow by modern robot standards, would be stripped in a season if the wrong crew got the numbers. Here is the thing about calling a 500-year-old ship ancient. To the ocean, 500 years is nothing, barely a scratch. There is a wreck in the eastern Mediterranean carrying jars that were packed while pharaohs were still building tombs. It sits over a mile down. It is more than 3,000 years old, and the people who found it were not looking for history. They were looking for natural gas. The survey team thought they were looking at rocks. An energy company was mapping the seafloor off the coast of Israel, checking the ground before drilling for gas. Standard work. A robot flew over the mud about a mile and a half down, cameras rolling, and the screen filled with a scattering of dark lumps in a rough oval. Somebody looked closer. The lumps had handles. Under Israeli law, if you find something like that, you have to report it. So the company sent the images to the government archaeologists, and a man named Jacob Sharvit opened them at his desk and nearly fell out of his chair. He knew that shape. Everybody in his field knows that shape. They were storage jars, hundreds of them piled where they spilled, made by people living in the Bronze Age. The date came back between 1400 and 1300 years before the Common Era. Around 3,300 years old. That puts this ship on the water while Egypt was ruled by pharaohs, before the Trojan War was even a story. more than 1,000 years before Rome was a serious city. The wood is gone, the clams got it, the way they always do. The ship left an outline instead, marked by its own cargo, roughly 40 feet of jars lying in the shape of a hull that dissolved around them. Under all that pottery, in the sediment, there may still be beams. Nobody knows, because getting down there again costs a fortune. What makes this wreck rewrite a textbook is where it is. It sank about 50 miles from the nearest coast, in water more than a mile deep, far out where you cannot see land in any direction. And for a long time, historians were sure ancient sailors never did that. The picture everybody carried was of cautious crews hugging the shoreline, keeping a hill or a headland in view, ducking into a bay when the weather turned. This ship says otherwise. It was crossing open sea, out of sight of everything, which means the crew was steering by the sun and the stars and the swell, with no compass, no map, and no way to know how far they had drifted. Charvet put it simply, the find changes what we thought ancient sailors could do. They were better than us at the one thing we assume technology invented. 2 of the jars came up. Archaeologists cracked them open expecting dirt and found traces of what the ship had been carrying. Oil, wine, fruit. The stuff of a working trade route, moving between the coasts of the Mediterranean while somebody's boss waited at a port for a delivery that never showed. Nobody knows what killed it. A storm probably. Maybe pirates. The crew, whoever they were, are 3,000 years past caring. There is a pattern forming in these stories, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A gas survey found the oldest deep wreck on the planet. A Navy training run found the deepest wreck in France. Nobody was hunting either one. The ocean does not hand things over when you ask. It hands them over when you are busy with something else. Which is how, in 2015, a fleet of ships combing the emptiest stretch of the Indian Ocean for a vanished airliner ended up finding 2 sailing ships that had been missing since the 1800s. The search box was the size of Greece, and there was nothing in it. In March of 2014, a Malaysia Airlines jet with 239 people aboard turned off course and disappeared. No wreckage, no signal. Just a few faint pings from a satellite that suggested the plane had flown south for hours until the fuel ran out, somewhere in one of the loneliest patches of water on Earth, off the west coast of Australia. So ships went out and started mowing the seabed. Sonar towed on cables miles long, sweeping back and forth night and day for years. The crews were looking for aluminum, wings, engines, anything with straight lines. The seafloor down there had never been mapped. They were driving through a landscape nobody had ever seen, in water 2 miles deep, and everything the sonar found was a mystery until they checked it. In 2015, a strong return came back. Hard metal, a dense cluster sitting alone on the bottom. Hopes went up. The searchers sent down a robot with cameras. It was a ship, a wooden sailing ship, at least a century old, blown apart across the mud with an anchor lying nearby and a cargo of coal spilled around it. The wood had mostly gone, eaten in the way you now know by heart, and the iron fittings had settled into the shape of a hull that was no longer there. Then, months later, about 20 miles away, they found another one. This one was iron, and bigger, and it looked like it had exploded. Coal again, scattered wide. Coal dust in a ship's hold can build up gas, and if a spark finds it, the ship tears itself open at sea and goes down in minutes with everyone aboard. Neither wreck is confirmed. Both are the kind of case that historians argue about for decades. The wooden ship might be a vessel called the Westridge, or the Magdala, or one of several others that sailed out of Britain in the 1800s carrying coal and never arrived. The iron ship has its own list of candidates. All of them are ships that vanished. Ships whose families never got an answer, never got a grave, never got anything except a date and a name on a shipping list. Now think about what that means. 2 ships, lost for over a century, sitting in a place so remote that in all of human history nobody had ever looked at that ground. Not once, and they turned up by accident, in a search for a plane that had crashed 130 years after they sank, in the same empty water, on the same route across the bottom of the world. The searchers logged them, photographed them, handed the data to museums and moved on. They had 239 people to find. They never found the plane. The wrecks they did not want are the only ships that search ever located. That is the deep ocean's arithmetic. Most of the seabed has never been seen by anything with eyes. Every sweep of the sonar is a coin flip on ground nobody has visited, and the ghosts turn up whether you invited them or not. Some hunters, though, know exactly what they are after. because a few of these wrecks went down with cargo worth more than the ships that carried it, and there are people who spend their lives working out where the money sank. The Rio Grande was running for home when the shells found her. She was a German merchant ship in 1944, and her job was to sneak. Germany needed raw materials from Asia and had no way to ship them, because the Royal Navy owned the sea lanes. So the Germans sent lone freighters on impossible runs, painted in disguise, flying false flags, taking wild routes through empty ocean, hoping nobody stopped them. Sailors called those ships blockade runners. Most of them died. She was loaded with the sort of cargo that decides wars: 500 tons of tin, over 2,000 tons of copper, 300 tons of cobalt, enough metal to build ammunition, wire and armour for months of fighting, everything hanging on one ship, one crew, and one gamble. In January of 1944, 2 American warships caught her in the South Atlantic, out where the map is just blue for 1,000 miles in every direction. The crew scuttled her rather than hand her over, and she went down carrying her metal into water more than 3.5 miles deep, and then she was gone. Not just sunk, erased. A ship lost in the middle of an ocean nobody could search, in a spot recorded by men in a rolling warship with a sextant and a rough idea of where they were. 52 years later, a wreck hunter named David Mearns decided to go get her. The search itself is the story. Mearns did not have a location. He had scraps, old radio logs, a position from a captain who was guessing, survivor accounts from men who'd been swimming for their lives. He read everything, cross-checked every number, and drew a box on a chart the size of a small country. Then he went out with sonar and started sweeping. Wreck hunting at that depth is like dragging a flashlight across a football field at midnight, one narrow strip at a time, and the flashlight is on a 5-mile cable behind a boat. In November of 1996, the sonar drew a shape. The Rio Grande was sitting at 18,900 feet, and for a long stretch of years she was the deepest shipwreck any human being had ever found. That record held until the 2 destroyers off Samar took it away, which means for over 2 decades the deepest known wreck on Earth was a German freighter nobody has heard of. Here is what the pictures showed. Her hull sat mostly whole. Her cargo was right there in the holds, exactly where it was loaded in Japan. Metal is patient. It waited. And in 2018, cobalt was going for over $90,000 a ton, which means the cargo of a ship sunk in a war your great-grandparents fought is worth a fortune today. That is the tension running under every deep wreck story. Finding a ship is a triumph. Reaching into it is a different act entirely, with lawyers, governments, and the families of dead men all standing in the way. Nobody has emptied the Rio Grande. Nobody has tried, seriously, because at 3.5 miles down, the operation would cost more than the metal. But somebody did prove it can be done. Somebody sent robots 3 miles down to a ship full of British coins and brought back 100 tons of silver. The submarine surfaced next to the lifeboats, and the German captain apologised. The city of Cairo was a British passenger steamer, slow and old, carrying 302 people across the South Atlantic in November of 1942. Families, crew, children going home. Down in her hold, packed in crates that nobody on board talked about, sat 100 tons of silver coins, shipped from India to help pay for the war. A German submarine put a torpedo into her about 500 miles south of a speck of land called St. Helena, roughly the middle of nowhere. The ship stayed up long enough for the passengers to get into 6 lifeboats. Then a second torpedo finished her, and she started her fall toward a seabed 3 miles down. The submarine commander came alongside the boats in the dark. He gave them the course to the nearest land. He wished them good night and told them he was sorry for sinking them, and left. Sailors have argued about that moment ever since. What followed was worse than the sinking. The boats scattered. They drifted for weeks in open ocean under a tropical sun, rationing water by the spoonful. One boat sailed for 36 days before hitting South America. Another was picked up by a ship that was itself torpedoed and sunk days later, which meant some survivors got rescued twice. Of the 302 who started, roughly 100 never came home. The silver went down with the ship and stayed there for almost 70 years. Then a salvage company called Deep Ocean Search took the job. Same problem as always. No coordinates, just a rough position from a torpedoed ship in the dark. They read the old accounts, ran the currents backward, drew a search box, and started sweeping a piece of ocean floor bigger than most cities, 17,000 feet down. They found her in 2011, broken and half buried, sitting deeper than any wreck anyone had ever tried to salvage. The recovery is the part that sounds like science fiction. No human being went near it. Robots did the whole thing, hanging on cables 3 miles long, working in the dark with cameras and cutting tools, digging through collapsed steel to reach the strong room. They cut a hole. They reached in. They started lifting coins. Over the next 2 years, they brought up 100 tons of silver, worth something like $34 million. It is still the deepest salvage operation ever done, and the company was working legally, under contract, with the British government taking a cut. The coins were mostly melted down, a few were kept, so the tools now exist. Robots can find a wreck 3 miles down and take what is inside it, and the only thing stopping anyone is money and permission. Hold that thought, because permission is where this gets ugly. There is a Spanish galleon lying off the coast of Colombia, sunk in 1708, packed with gold, silver, and emeralds. The value estimates run towards $17 billion. 3 governments and a private company all claim it. None of them will back down, and the ship has been sitting on the seabed for years while lawyers fight over a treasure nobody's allowed to touch. The explosion was so bright that men on the British ship chasing her had to look away. The San Jose was a Spanish galleon, 64 guns, sailing off the coast of Colombia in June of 1708. She was the flagship of the treasure fleet, and her hold was the reason the Spanish Empire could pay its bills. Gold from Peru, silver dug out of a mountain in Bolivia, emeralds, chests of coins stacked in the dark below decks. A British squadron caught her near Cartagena and closed in to board. They wanted the cargo whole, so they were shooting at her rigging, trying to slow her down. Then something reached her powder magazine. The whole ship went up in a single flash and sank inside a few minutes. Roughly 600 men were aboard. 11 of them lived. The treasure that England had chased across an ocean dropped straight to the seabed, and the war it was supposed to pay for ground on without it. For 300 years she was a rumour. In 2015, the Colombian Navy went out with a robot built by American oceanographers and started flying grid lines about 2,000 feet down. The machine came back with pictures of a wreck field, and the fingerprint was sitting right there on the mud. Cannons. Bronze ones, half buried, with dolphins cast into the metal near the handles. That decoration was a signature. Somebody in a Spanish foundry put those dolphins there, and no other ship in the world carries them. The San Jose had a name again. She also had a price tag, and this is where the story stops being about history. Estimates of what is in that hold run as high as $17 billion. That is more money than most countries spend on their schools in a year, sitting on the ocean floor, in a spot Colombia guards like a military base, and refuses to publish. Now count the hands going up. Colombia says the wreck is national heritage and belongs to Colombia. Spain says the ship was Spanish, so the ship and everything in it are still Spanish. An American salvage company says it found the wreck decades earlier and is owed half, and it has been suing about it for years. And a group of indigenous people from Bolivia has entered the fight with an argument nobody has a good answer for. That silver came out of a mountain called Potosí, where their ancestors were worked to death by the thousands to dig it. They say the treasure was stolen before the ship ever sank, and no court in Europe or America has any right to hand it around. Everyone has a point. Nobody will move. So it sat. For years, one of the richest objects on the planet stayed in the dark while lawyers argued in 3 languages, because touching it would mean choosing a side. Recently, Colombia started sending robots down to lift small pieces, a coin here, a cup there, treating the site as an archaeology project instead of a bank vault. Every recovery makes the lawyers louder. Here is the part that lingers. 600 people died in that flash, and almost nobody in this fight talks about them. The ship is treasure now. The crew is footnotes, which raises the question underneath all of it. What is a wreck exactly? Property? Evidence? A grave? The answer changes depending on who sank, and one German battleship makes the whole argument personal. 2,000 men went down with her, and nobody could agree on who killed them. The British said their guns did it. The Germans said they sank her themselves. The seabed settled it, and only because the ship landed in the strangest place a wreck can land. The Bismarck was the ship that broke the rules of arguing. She was the biggest, newest battleship Germany had in 1941. On her first trip out, she met a British squadron in the North Atlantic and destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy, a battlecruiser called the Hood, in about 8 minutes. One shell reached the magazine and the hood came apart. 1,400 men died, 3 survived. Britain lost its mind. Winston Churchill sent every ship he had after her, and the chase ran for 3 days across 1,000 miles of ocean. A torpedo from an old biplane jammed her rudder. She could only steer in a slow circle. The British fleet caught up and unloaded on her, and for over an hour they fired shells the size of refrigerators into her upper decks at close range until nothing on top was recognisable. She would not sink. She burned, she stopped shooting back, and she still floated. British ships put torpedoes into her from a few hundred yards away. Then she rolled over and went down. About 2,000 men died. 114 were pulled out of the water. Then the argument started and it lasted 50 years. The British said their guns and torpedoes sank her. German survivors said their own crew scuttled the ship. Charges set in the engine rooms, valves opened, a deliberate choice to drown her rather than let the Royal Navy tow the flagship home as a trophy. 2 versions of the same afternoon, both told by men who were there. In 1989, Robert Ballard went to settle it. He found her almost 16,000 feet down, roughly 3 miles, in a place that made no sense at first. She was sitting upright, level, her hull whole from bow to stern, guns still pointed out, a battleship parked in the mud like she was at anchor. Deep wrecks are supposed to be torn apart. This one looked like a model on a table. The reason turned out to be the ground she landed on. She came down on the slope of an undersea mountain, and the impact triggered a landslide. Thousands of tons of mud let go and slid downhill, and the ship rode it, sliding for over a mile until the whole mess came to rest on flat bottom. The landslide caught her like a hand and set her down. Then the cameras started reading her hull, and the argument ended. Her sides were almost clean. Her armour belt, the thick steel wrapped around the middle of the ship, had held. The British shells had wrecked everything above the waterline, killed the crew, turned the superstructure into scrap, and never punched through into the spaces that keep a ship floating. Torpedo damage below was there, and it was not enough. The British had beaten her. They had not sunk her. The Germans had sunk her, because the ship was already dead and they refused to hand her over. That is what a wreck can do. 2 navies telling opposite stories for half a century, and a camera 3 miles down looks at a wall of steel and calls it. The seabed does not lie and does not care. Which is why a year later Ballard went hunting for another ship, one lost in the Pacific during a battle that decided a war, and what he found still looks so untouched that it feels staged. Somebody left a car parked on the hangar deck. The Yorktown should not have been at the Battle of Midway. She limped into Pearl Harbor in May of 1942 with a bomb hole through her flight deck, and damage the repair crew said would take 3 months to fix. The Admiral gave them 72 hours. 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, welding in shifts, and she sailed out with wires still running through her passageways and men still working inside her. 3 days later, she helped win the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. Japanese planes found her anyway. Bombs, then torpedoes, then a submarine. She took hits that would have finished any other carrier, kept fighting, kept launching aircraft, and finally rolled over on June 7th and sank into water 3 miles deep. Robert Ballard went looking for her in 1998, and this time the search was almost worse than the Titanic, because the battlefield was enormous, and the ocean floor there is a plane the size of a state. He found her at 16,650 feet. She's standing upright. Her hull is whole, and the detail that hits everyone first is the paint. It is still on her. Her hull number is still readable. The anti-aircraft guns are still aimed at a sky they cannot see, and the cruise gear is still where it was dropped. She looks less like a wreck, and more like a ship somebody put away wet. Then a research team went back with better robots in 2025, and the pictures came back stranger than anyone expected. On the wall of the hangar deck, painted straight onto the steel, was a mural, a giant hand-drawn map of the whole world, tracking every port the ship had ever visited, made by her own crew as a joke on a scoreboard. It had never been photographed. Nobody in the world knew it existed because everyone who'd seen it was either dead or had never mentioned it. 83 years underwater, and the paint is still bright enough to read the coastlines. And parked on that hangar deck, next to the mural, was a car, an actual automobile, a black sedan from around 1940, the kind with wooden panels on the sides, sitting on 4 flat tyres 3 miles under the Pacific Ocean. Nobody's completely sure why it is there. The best guess is that it belonged to an officer, and when the ship left Pearl Harbor in that mad 72-hour rush, somebody rolled it aboard rather than leave it on the dock. Then the ship was hit, and the crew was busy fighting for their lives, and nobody had time to think about the car, so it went down with her, and it is still parked. That is the thing about these deep wrecks that gets under your skin. They are not history exactly. They are an interrupted Tuesday, a mug on a table, a mural somebody was proud of, a car somebody planned to drive again. The Yorktown gets talked about because she was found, photographed, and left alone. The next ship in this story is the opposite. She sank in 12 minutes, and the tragedy did not happen on the ship at all. It happened afterward, to 900 men floating in open water for 4 days, while the sharks came in and the Navy did not even know they were missing. The mission was so secret that when the ship disappeared, nobody was allowed to ask where she was. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser, and in July of 1945 she carried the core of the first atomic bomb across the Pacific to an island called Tinian. She dropped the cargo off and sailed on alone. No escort, no sonar gear for spotting submarines, nobody watching her track, because the delivery had been classified so tightly that her movements were left off the boards where the Navy kept score. Just after midnight on July 30th, a Japanese submarine put 2 torpedoes into her side. She went down in 12 minutes. That is not enough time. 12 minutes to wake up, get topside, and get off a ship that is already rolling. About 300 men died in the sinking itself. Roughly 900 made it into the water. That is where the real horror starts. They had almost no lifeboats. Most of them were floating in kapok life jackets, tied together in clusters, spread across miles of open ocean under a sun that comes up hard and does not quit. No food, no water, and nobody, anywhere, knew they were there. The sharks arrived on the first day, oceanic whitetips mostly. The species that patrols open water far from land, cruising the empty blue, waiting for something to fall in. They came for the dead first, working the edges of the groups, taking the bodies that drifted loose. Then they started testing the living. Survivors described treading water in silence, listening for the scream, watching a man get pulled straight down without warning. Sailors pushed the dead away from the group on purpose, because a body attracts the sharks, and pushing your friend into the dark was the only thing you could do for the people still breathing. Thirst did as much killing as the fish. Drink seawater and the salt drives you insane before it kills you. Men saw islands that were not there. They saw ships. Some swam off to reach a hotel they were sure was floating nearby, and never came back. Some fought each other over hallucinations. They were in the water for 4 days. Nobody came, because nobody noticed. The ship never arrived at her destination, and the officers who should have raised an alarm assumed she had been rerouted, because a secret ship keeps secret schedules. The Navy simply had no idea. A patrol plane found them by pure luck on the 4th day, a pilot spotting an oil slick and then dots in the water. Rescue ships came running. Of the roughly 900 who made it into the ocean, 316 were still alive. The Navy court marshalled her captain, Charles McVeigh, for losing the ship. It was the only such case against a captain in the entire war for a ship lost to enemy action, and the Navy brought over the Japanese submarine commander to testify against him, and even he said McVeigh could not have avoided it. McVeigh carried the blame and the hate mail from grieving families for decades, and in 1968 he took his own life. Congress cleared his name in the year 2000, 32 years too late. The wreck itself stayed lost for 72 years, because those 12 minutes gave nobody time to fix a position. A search team found her in 2017, 18,000 feet down in the Philippine Sea, sitting in 3 big pieces on the mud. Cameras have visited. Nothing has been taken. Not a rivet. That is a rule almost everyone in this field follows now, and it is worth understanding why, because the rule is newer than you think, and there are crews out there breaking it in the dark. 800 men are still inside the Arizona. Their ship burned and sank at Pearl Harbor in 1941 in about 40 feet of water, close enough to shore that you can see her from a bus stop. Divers could walk through her. Nobody does. There is a white building sitting over her hull, and every day tourists stand on it and look down at oil still bubbling up from her tanks, one drop at a time, 85 years later. Nobody argues about that one. It is obviously a grave. Now move the same ship 4 miles under the Pacific and the argument starts. The rule most navies use is straightforward. A warship belongs to the country that built her forever, no matter where she sinks or how much time passes. Sovereign immunity, they call it. The wreck is still government property, still a piece of that navy, and the country never gave up ownership just because the ship got wet, so the Sammy B is still United States Navy property. So is the Johnston. So is the Yorktown. You cannot salvage them any more than you could walk into a naval base and start unbolting things. On top of that sits the harder claim. Men died there and were never buried anywhere else, so the wreck is a cemetery, and you treat it like one. That is why the explorers in these stories keep behaving the same way. Look, photograph, measure, touch nothing. Vescovo scanned the Johnston for hours and took nothing, then handed every scan and photograph to the Navy for free. The teams that found the Indianapolis did the same. Nobody sends up a souvenir, and the location stays secret. Not vague, secret. The exact coordinates of the Sammy B are locked away by the people who found her, and by the Navy, and France is doing the same thing with its 500-year-old pottery wreck, and Colombia is doing it with the galleon. That secrecy sounds paranoid until you learn what happens when a location gets out. Because the ownership rules only work if somebody enforces them, and out in the open ocean nobody is watching. There is no patrol car, no fence, no alarm. A wreck in international water is protected by a piece of paper, and by the fact that reaching it is expensive. Reaching it stopped being expensive. The gear that once required a billionaire and a research vessel now fits on a barge. Sonar is cheap. Robots are cheap. A crew with a crane and a grab bucket can work a wreck for months and never see another ship on the horizon. And this is not a warning about something that might happen. Somewhere in the Java Sea there are 3 British warships that sank in 1942 with more than 1,000 men aboard. Divers went back to visit them a few years ago. The ships were not there, not damaged, not looted. Gone. Entire warships, hundreds of feet long, lifted off the seabed and hauled away, and nobody saw it happen. The divers were looking for a battleship, and the sonar showed a hole in the mud. In 2016, a team went out into the Java Sea to visit 3 British warships. The Exeter, the Encounter, and the Electra had gone down in a battle in 1942, fighting a Japanese fleet that outnumbered them badly, and more than 1,000 men had died with them. Divers had visited the wrecks a few years earlier, filmed them, and left them alone. Everyone knew exactly where they were. The team ran the sonar over the coordinates and got flat bottom. They ran it again. Still nothing. They sent robots down and found a scar, a long depression pressed into the seabed in the shape of a ship, with a scatter of small debris around the edges and a few chunks of steel too mangled to be worth taking. The ships were gone, not collapsed, not buried, removed. Then the story got worse. The Dutch had lost 2 cruisers in the same battle, and those were gone too. An American submarine on the same seafloor had vanished. 6 warships, hundreds of feet long, thousands of tons each, lifted out of the ocean and hauled away without a single person noticing. Here is how you steal a battleship. You bring a barge with a crane, and you park it over the wreck. Sometimes you drop explosives first to break the hull into pieces you can lift. Then you drag up a claw, over and over for weeks, tearing off whatever comes loose. Steel plating, bronze propellers, copper wiring. The scrap goes to a yard, gets melted, and comes back as rebar in a building somewhere. The crews work in international water where no Coast Guard patrols. Fishermen see the barge and assume it is doing something legal. Everything else comes up with it. Boots, buttons, bones. Investigators later found mass graves near the Java Sea coast, filled with human remains that had come off wrecks. The families of those sailors had spent 70 years knowing exactly where their fathers were. Then one day nobody could tell them anymore. Governments were furious. The British complained. The Dutch launched an investigation. Nothing happened because nobody could prove which barge did it, and the wrecks were the only evidence, and the wrecks had been melted down. This is not a Java Sea problem. Wrecks have been getting stripped in the South China Sea, off Malaysia, all through the shallow parts of the Pacific where the war left ships lying in reachable water. Estimates run to dozens of vessels gone. Now you understand why every explorer in this story keeps their mouth shut about coordinates. Publish a location, and you have written a shopping address. The obvious question is why? Scrap steel is cheap. Melting down a warship at the bottom of the ocean with barges and cranes and explosives and a crew costs a fortune. The math should not work. The math works because of something the war left behind. There is a kind of steel down there that cannot be made anymore, not by any factory on Earth, at any price, with any technology. We poisoned the recipe in 1945, and every furnace on the planet has been contaminated ever since, so the only clean supply left is sitting in the wrecks. Every piece of steel made after 1945 is slightly radioactive, and it is our fault. Start with how steel gets made. You melt iron, and to burn off the impurities you blast enormous volumes of air through it. Tons of air for every ton of metal. Whatever is floating in that air gets folded into the steel and locked there permanently. Then humans started testing nuclear weapons in the open sky. Hundreds of blasts from the mid-1940s into the early 60s threw radioactive particles into the atmosphere, and the wind spread them everywhere. One of them was a form of cobalt, made when a blast fires neutrons into ordinary metal. It settled into the air over every country, over every ocean, over every steel mill on Earth. So every furnace since then has been breathing dusted air, and every batch of steel since then carries a faint radioactive whisper inside it. The amount is tiny. It will never hurt you. Your car has it. The beams holding up your school have it. You could sleep on a pile of it. The problem is the machine's built to hear whispers. A radiation detector works by counting. It sits there listening for signals so faint that a single particle matters. Now build the housing for that detector out of steel that is quietly ticking, and the machine hears its own body. It is a microphone made out of a speaker. Same for the sensors in some medical scanners, the instruments that check for contamination at nuclear plants, and equipment that goes into space where every count has to mean something. Those machines need metal that has never breathed a poisoned sky. There is only one place to get it. Steel poured before the first bomb went off. People pulled it out of old buildings and scrapped bridges for years, and they pulled it out of shipwrecks, because a warship is thousands of tons of pre-1945 steel sitting in one convenient pile sealed underwater, untouched by the air that ruined everything above it. That is the reason the Java Sea wrecks were worth a barge and a crane and a crime, not scrap prices. This. There is one more turn in this story, and it is the part almost nobody mentions. Countries stopped testing weapons in the open air in the 1960s. The cobalt in the atmosphere has been fading ever since because it decays, and half of it disappears roughly every 5 years. 60 years of that adds up. Modern mills also use pure oxygen now instead of raw air, so they're pulling in less junk to begin with. Which means the fresh steel coming out of a factory today is nearly as clean as the old stuff, and the shortage that made wrecks valuable has mostly evaporated. So thousands of men were dug out of their graves and melted into construction rebar for a reason that was already running out of steam. That is the ugly heart of every wreck story. Value moves. History does not get a vote. Meanwhile, the ships still out there are protected by one thing only. Nobody knows where they are, which sounds like weak protection, until you try to find one and learn what it actually takes to spot a ship the size of a football field in a place with no light, no map, and no landmarks at all. You cannot see a shipwreck. You can only hear its shadow. Light dies within a few hundred feet of the surface. Radio dies faster. Your eyes and your phone and your satellites are useless the moment you go under, and the ocean floor is the largest unexplored surface in the solar system. We have better maps of the far side of the moon than we have of the bottom of our own planet. So wreck hunters use sound, and the tool is a torpedo-shaped machine called a towfish. You drag it behind your ship on a cable, sometimes 5 miles of cable, hanging just above the seabed. It fires sound sideways in a fan, listens for the echoes, and paints a picture line by line as it flies. Hard things bounce sound back bright. Soft mud comes back dull, and anything standing up throws a sound shadow behind it, a dark stripe of nothing, because the sound could not reach that patch of ground. The shadow is the whole game. Hunters barely look at the object. They read the shadow because a shadow tells you the height and shape of what made it, and a warship makes a shadow you can recognize. Now here is why this is slow. The towfish sees a strip a few hundred yards wide, that's it. You have to drive back and forth over the search area in long parallel lines like mowing a lawn, at the speed of a person walking, dragging 5 miles of cable behind you. Turning around takes hours because the cable has to swing, and the lawn is enormous. A search box for a lost ship is routinely bigger than a city, sometimes bigger than a small country. Miss a line by a little, and you leave a stripe of unsearched ground, and the ship could be sitting in it forever, which is why the real work happens before the boat leaves. The best hunters are researchers first. They find the last radio message. They pull the log of the ship that watched her sink, then check the weather that day, the currents, the drift. They interview survivors, or read what survivors said 60 years ago. They take a position written down by a terrified officer on a rolling deck, and work out how wrong it probably was, and in which direction. One team took it further. When an American submarine went missing in 1968, a naval officer named John Craven gathered a group of experts and had them bet on what happened, then combined the guesses into a probability map, treating the whole thing like a math problem instead of a mystery. The ship went to the highest square on the map and found the submarine there. You're not searching for a ship, you're searching for the most likely place a ship would be, and then the next most likely until the ocean gives up. That is what Ballard did when he stopped looking for the Titanic and started looking for her trash. That is what Mearns did with the blockade runner nobody could place. Everyone in this story won on land with paper before they ever got wet. Then the sonar draws a shape, and you send something down to look, and the cameras come on, and you finally see the place these ships have been living. It is the biggest habitat on Earth. It takes up most of the space where life exists on this planet, and almost nothing you know applies down there. Turn the lights off on the seabed and your eyes never adjust because there is nothing to adjust to. Not dim, not shadowy, zero. The last sunlight gave up more than 3 miles above your head, and the darkness down here has been perfect for hundreds of millions of years. Nothing that lives in it has ever seen a day. The water sits a few degrees above freezing everywhere on Earth at this depth. Off the Philippines, off Iceland, off Brazil, the number barely changes. The tropics do not reach down here. Neither do the seasons. It is the same temperature at the bottom of the warm Caribbean as it is under the Antarctic ice, and it has been for longer than mammals have existed. Nothing moves. There is no wave, no storm, no weather. A current might drift past at the speed of a slow crawl. The mud is the flattest ground on the planet, stretching farther than any desert, and most of it is just soft grey ooze made of the corpses of things that sank. And this place is not a corner of the world. It is the world. Take every forest, every field, every mountain, every jungle, and stack them against the deep ocean, and they are a rounding error. Most of the living space on Earth is dark, freezing and crushing, and everything you have ever seen is a thin skin on top of it. So what does anything eat? Look up and you will see the answer, and it is beautiful and grim at the same time. It is snowing. Flakes drift down through the lights, thousands of them endlessly, and they never stop and never melt. Scientists call it marine snow. Every flake is a piece of something that died closer to the sun. Bits of dead plankton, broken shells, fish scales, waste, skin. Whatever was alive up in the light eventually falls apart and the pieces sink, and they take weeks to make the trip. That is the entire food supply for the deepest part of the planet. Leftovers, falling out of the sky, forever. By the time the snow reaches 4 miles, almost everything nutritious has been eaten on the way down. What lands is scraps of scraps, which is why the abyss runs in slow motion. Animals down there grow slowly, move slowly, breed slowly, and can go a year between meals without complaining. Speed costs food, and there is no food. Now you understand why the deepest wrecks look brand new. A ship on a reef gets swallowed by coral in 20 years, because the reef is a rainforest with a full pantry. A ship in the abyss lands in a place with no oxygen worth mentioning, no light, no warmth, and a starving population that would need a century to build up enough bodies to cover a gun barrel. The bacteria are there, and they're too hungry to accomplish much. The abyss preserves things because it cannot afford to destroy them. Then a warship falls out of the sky. 10 million pounds of steel standing up off the flat mud like a skyscraper dropped into a parking lot, in a neighbourhood where nothing taller than a pebble has ever existed. Something down there noticed immediately. The first pictures of the Titanic showed white shapes crawling on her decks. and nobody could figure out what they were doing there. The first thing you see is the eyes. Cameras swing over a wreck 4 miles down and something pale slides through the beam, hangs there, and turns. It has huge dark eyes, and a head too big for its body, and a tail that trails behind it like a ribbon. It looks like a fish that got stretched. They are called rat tails, and they are one of the most common fish on Earth. Almost nobody has heard of them, because they live where nobody goes. Watch what it does. It swims like it has all the time in the world because it does. Its whole strategy is patience. It cruises the mud with a nose built to smell, waiting for something dead to hit the bottom, and when a meal lands it will eat until it can barely swim, because the next one might be months away. Then look at the deck. Something is lying on the steel that looks like a dropped sock. That is a sea cucumber, and it is doing the only job available down here. It swallows mud. It runs the mud through its body, strips out the microscopic scraps of marine snow buried in it, and pushes the rest out the back. It is a vacuum cleaner with no bones. Some species have made themselves into most of the animal weight on the entire abyssal plain by doing nothing else, forever. Then the light catches movement in the sediment, and the ground boils. Amphipods. Little pale shrimp things, thumbnail-sized, sometimes bigger. They live buried and starving, and they can smell a meal from a distance. Drop a fish carcass at 4 miles, and they will find it in under an hour. Thousands of them, swarming so thick that the bait disappears under a shifting white carpet. Their guts contain something almost no other animal has, a chemistry that lets them digest wood, which is how they turn up inside sunken timber miles from any tree. Now put those animals in a shipwreck. They do not care that it was a warship. Steel is a wall to hide behind. A gun barrel is a perch that lifts you off the mud into the current, where the snow drifts past and the smells travel further. A hole in a hull is a cave, and there are no caves out here. On the Titanic, there are anemones sitting on the railings with their arms open, catching whatever falls. There are squat lobsters in the wreckage. There are the bacteria eating the hull, and there are animals eating the bacteria, and a food chain has assembled itself around a passenger liner in a place with no sunlight. That is the joke at the centre of all this. We keep calling these places graves. The animals down there call it the best real estate for 200 miles. Because the abyssal plain is a flat grey desert, and there is a rule of the deep that took scientists decades to work out. Life is not spread evenly down there. It clumps. It piles up wherever something hard sticks out of the mud and starves everywhere else. So when a ship lands, it does not just get colonised, it becomes a city, and the city can be the only one in a stretch of ocean bigger than a state. Drop a whale on the seabed, and you build a town that lasts 50 years. Scientists watched it happen. A dead whale sinks, hits the mud, and the mud around it is a desert like everything else. Within hours, the amphipods and the rat tails arrive to strip the meat. That stage lasts a couple of years, then worms move into the bones, and bacteria go after the fat locked inside the skeleton, and those bacteria feed shrimp, snails, clams, and animals nobody had ever seen before. The bones keep feeding the town for decades. Then the whale runs out, the town dies, and the babies scatter into the black to find the next corpse. Now understand what a shipwreck is in that world. A whale is a few tons of food. A warship is thousands of tons of hard surface, standing up off the flat with holes and ledges and rooms in it, and it never rots away in a decade like a skeleton does. It is a whale fall that lasts for centuries and has architecture. The mud desert has one thing missing more than food. It has nothing to hold on to. Half the animals in the ocean are built to grab a rock and let the water bring dinner to them. Corals, anemones, sponges, sea fans. They need something solid, and out on the abyssal plain there is nothing solid for hundreds of miles, only soft ooze that swallows anything that tries to grip it. Those animals have spent their whole evolutionary history hunting for a hard place to stand. Then a hull lands. Deep-sea corals colonise it. They grow at a crawl, sometimes less than the thickness of a coin every year, and they live for hundreds of years, which means a coral on a wreck from World War II is a teenager. Sponges settle on the guardrails. Anemones take the high spots where the current runs faster and carries more snow. Fish move in under the overhangs to hide from the fish that eat them. There is one more trick that only works with steel. The bacteria that eat the hull get their energy from the metal, not from sunlight. That means a shipwreck is doing something almost nothing else on the seabed can do. It is making new food out of a rock. The whole plane runs on leftovers falling from above, and here is a structure feeding animals from the inside out. The wreck is the only thing for miles making its own groceries. Scientists have started treating these sites as accidental experiments, thousands of them, all over the world, each one with a known start date. A reef where you know the exact day and hour it appeared is rare enough to be precious. Compare a wreck from 1942 with one from 1918, and you can watch how long the deep takes to build a community, which is a question nobody could answer any other way. So the ships are graves, and they are museums, and now they are oases. Which is exactly what makes the next part so hard to look at. Because the robot that filmed the 500-year-old pottery off France, with its bright blue glaze and its hand-painted fish, was flying over the seabed a mile and a half down, in one of the most remote spots in the Mediterranean. And in the same shot, lying beside the jugs, the cameras picked up something modern. The pottery came out of a workshop in Italy in the 1500s. The soda can did not. When the French Navy's robot mapped that wreck near Saint-Tropez, the images came back with two kinds of garbage on the seabed. One kind was 500 years old and priceless. The other kind was ours, cans, wrappers, plastic, lying in the same frame on the same mud, a mile and a half down, 30 miles from shore. That is not a French problem. Run the numbers anywhere, and you get the same answer. In 2018, a Japanese team went through a database of deep sea dive footage going back decades and pulled out every piece of trash the cameras had recorded. The deepest one was a plastic bag sitting at about 36,000 feet in the Mariana Trench, the bottom of the ocean, the single deepest place on the planet, a spot fewer people have visited than have walked on the moon. A shopping bag got there first. Then Victor Vescovo took his submarine to the bottom of that same trench and looked out the window and saw something with writing on it. He could not tell if it was a wrapper or a bag. It did not matter. The deepest point on Earth had litter in it. Here is why the deep collects our garbage instead of just holding it. The ocean has a downhill. Trash washes off a beach, drifts on the surface, gets waterlogged and sinks. Once it is sinking, it goes where the water goes, and the water eventually goes down. Canyons funnel it. Currents sweep it along the seafloor and pile it in low spots, exactly the way wind piles snow against a wall. Trenches are the lowest spots on the planet. Everything ends up in the bottom of the bowl, and nothing down there can handle it. You know why by now. Cold slows chemistry to a crawl. There is no sunlight to break plastic apart, and sunlight is what does most of that work up top. There is barely any oxygen, so a plastic bag that would go brittle and crumble in a few years on a beach can sit in a trench essentially unchanged, for centuries, maybe longer. Nobody knows the real number, because nobody has been able to watch long enough. Which puts a strange thought in front of you. Every wreck in this story is a message from a specific moment. The mug on the Johnston's deck says 1944. The car parked on the Yorktown says 1942. The jars from the Bronze Age wreck say the world of the pharaohs. Future scientists will find our layer too. It is already down there, resting on the same mud, next to a merchant ship from the 1500s, and it will outlast the ship because oak dissolves and steel gets eaten and plastic does neither. The abyss has been quietly saving everything we lose for as long as we have been sailing. Now here is the part nobody was expecting. Some of what we lost down there is still holding a full tank. There are thousands of ships on the seabed with oil sealed inside them, millions of gallons, and the steel around it has been thinning for 80 years. Stand on the memorial at Pearl Harbor and look down and you will see a rainbow spreading on the water. It comes up one drop at a time from the Arizona, sunk in 1941, still holding oil in her tanks. People call it the Black Tears. It has been leaking for 85 years, slow enough to look like a memorial instead of a spill, and nobody has ever emptied her, because getting the oil out would mean cutting into a grave. Now, multiply her by thousands. Researchers who track this have counted somewhere around 8,000 sunken vessels around the world that could turn into a pollution event. Most of them went down during the two world wars, tankers, freighters, warships with bunkers full of fuel. The estimates of what is trapped inside them run into the billions of gallons of oil. Compare that to a disaster you may have heard of. The blowout in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 spilled about 200 million gallons and it dominated the news for months. The oil sitting in the wrecks is many times that. It is sitting still, and it is sitting in tanks that are getting thinner every year. Here is the clock nobody set. Steel corrodes in seawater at a fairly steady rate. Slower in cold, faster in warm, faster where the current runs. Marine engineers estimate that a ship's hull plate loses a measurable fraction of itself every decade, and most of these wrecks are 80 years old. The tanks were built to hold pressure, so they were thick to begin with, and that thickness bought us 80 quiet years. That is running out. The people who study this describe the same picture over and over. Thousands of hulls approaching the end of their strength at roughly the same time because they were built at roughly the same time and dumped in the ocean during the same 6-year window. And some of them are not in the abyss, they are in shallow water, near coasts, near reefs, near towns. This has already happened. A ship called the Jacob Luckenbach sank off San Francisco in 1953 and lay forgotten. Then birds started washing up dead on the beaches, oiled year after year, and nobody could work out where the oil was coming from, for decades. Somebody finally tested it, matched the chemistry to the wreck, and found the source lying on the seabed. That one wreck killed tens of thousands of seabirds before anyone knew it was there. Governments know, the Pacific Islands know, because they have hundreds of these wrecks in reefs that feed their people. A few of the worst offenders have been pumped out, one at a time by teams drilling into a hull and sucking 80-year-old fuel up through a hose. It costs millions per ship. There are thousands of ships, so the plan mostly is to wait and hope. There is one more thing down there, and it makes the oil look almost polite, because after the war ended, the winners had a problem. Warehouses full of chemical weapons and no idea what to do with them. So they loaded them onto ships and sailed out into the deep and let the sea take the problem away. Fishermen still pull the results up in their nets. The lump in the net looked like a rock, and the fisherman picked it up with his hands. Hours later, his skin came off in sheets. The Baltic Sea is the worst place on the planet for this, and the reason is a decision made in 1947. When the war ended, the winners inherited warehouses stuffed with the chemical weapons Germany had built and never used. Nobody had a way to destroy them safely. So the order went out to dump them, and ships hauled roughly 40,000 tons of chemical munitions out to sea and pushed them over the side. Some crews sailed to the deep spots they were told to use. Some got tired or scared or lazy and dumped early in water a few hundred feet deep near coastlines and fishing grounds. Nobody wrote down where. The paperwork was rushed, secret, or invented. So there are shells lying on the Baltic floor right now, and nobody has a reliable map. Most of them hold mustard agent, which is not a gas at the bottom of the ocean. It is thick, sticky, and heavier than water, and in the cold it turns into a waxy lump. That lump can sit on the seabed for decades looking like a stone. Then a trawl net drags over it and hauls it up onto a deck, and a person touches it. It burns. Not right away. The victim feels nothing for hours, which is the cruelest part of it, and then the blisters start. Baltic fishermen have been going to hospitals over this for 70 years. Chunks have washed up on beaches where children were playing and been mistaken for amber, because amber looks like a yellow lump and washes up on those same beaches. The steel is the timer. Those shells have been corroding since Truman was president, and researchers who go down and look at them describe casings that are visibly failing, thinning, some already open and leaking into the mud around them. It is not only the Baltic. Weapons were dumped off Japan, off the American coasts, in the deep channel between Britain and Ireland where the seabed is littered with more than 1 million tons of munitions, ordinary and otherwise, and a mile from a town in England, a wrecked American freighter has been sitting in shallow water since 1944, with 1,400 tons of explosives still in her holds. Her masts stick out of the water, you can see them from shore. Nobody will touch her because studies suggest that if she ever went up, she would throw a column of water hundreds of feet into the air and break windows across the town. So the country built a ring of buoys around her and posts a guard and waits. That is the pattern in every one of these stories. We put something in the deep because the deep felt like an ending, and it turned out to be storage. Now the last chapter of that habit is starting. Machines the size of houses are being built to drive across the abyssal plain and vacuum up the rocks lying on it, because those rocks are full of metal that batteries need. The maps for those mining zones cover millions of square miles of seafloor that no human eye has ever inspected. Nobody knows what ships are down there. There is a patch of the Pacific between Hawaii and Mexico that is bigger than Europe, and the floor of it is covered in rocks that should not exist. They are black, roughly the size of a potato, and they are lying loose on the mud in enormous fields, millions of them, spread across the plain like somebody dumped a truckload every few feet for 1,000 miles. They are called nodules, and they are made of manganese, nickel, cobalt and copper. They grow. That is the strange part. A nodule starts as a scrap of something, a shark tooth, a piece of shell, and metal dissolved in the seawater slowly settles onto it. Layer by layer, the way a pearl builds. The rate is roughly the thickness of a fingernail every million years. The rock in a mining company's photograph is older than the human species by a wide margin. And the metals inside are exactly the metals the world wants for batteries. So companies have built machines to go get them. Picture a tractor the size of a small house, dropped 4 kilometers into the dark, crawling across the seabed on treads, sucking up the top few inches of mud and rock and sending it to the surface through a pipe miles long. The waste comes back down as a plume. That plume is why archaeologists are shouting. You already know what that seabed looks like. Flat, soft, ancient. Nothing has disturbed it for millions of years. Kick up a cloud down there and it does not settle in an afternoon like dust in a room. It hangs, drifts on the slow current, and rains out over an area far larger than the strip that was mined. Studies of test sites from the 1970s found the tracks still visible in the mud decades later, sharp as the day they were cut, with the life around them still not recovered. Now put a shipwreck in that path. We have no idea what is down there. Ships have been crossing the Pacific for centuries. Spanish galleons ran a route across it for 200 years, and some of them never arrived. Warships went down in the war by the hundreds and many were never located. Every wreck in this entire story was found by somebody looking hard in a small box, and almost none of that ocean has ever been searched. And here is the number that ends the argument. Somewhere around a quarter of the world's seafloor has been mapped in decent detail. The rest is a guess drawn from satellites. Mining companies are being handed contract areas that have been photographed in patches, at best. There is no way to avoid a wreck you have never seen. The rules exist, technically. An international authority is supposed to write the code, and the code is supposed to require companies to look for cultural sites before they dig. Archaeologists point out the obvious problem. A company that finds a protected wreck in its claim loses money, and the same company is the one doing the survey. Nobody has mined commercially yet. Everyone is close, and the arguments in those meetings are getting loud, which brings this whole story back to the water where it started, and to the thing that has been sitting underneath every chapter of it. The Sammy B, deepest wreck ever found, is nowhere near the bottom. The trench she fell into keeps going down for 2 more miles, and there are ships from her own battle still missing in it. The Sammy B is sitting on a shelf. That is the fact that undoes everything you thought you learned in this story. She is the deepest shipwreck on Earth, 4 1/3 miles down, in a place so extreme that almost the whole ocean is shallower than her grave, and she is not on the bottom. The Philippine Trench runs right past her, and the floor of it lies at about 34,500 feet, almost 6.5 miles. The Sammy B is more than 2 miles above the deepest ground in her own neighbourhood. Drop the tallest mountain on the planet into that trench, and the summit would still be a mile underwater, and the wreck that holds the world record is resting on the slope, well up the hill from the real dark. Now count who else went down that morning. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers in the same battle. The Chokai, the Chikuma, the Suzuya. Big ships, hundreds of feet longer than the Sammy B, thousands of men aboard. They sank into the same water in the same few hours, along the same stretch of coast. Nobody has found them. The teams have looked. They have swept the seabed and pulled up sonar shapes and gone down to check, and they have brought back pieces of ships they cannot conclusively name. The wrecks are somewhere in that trench, and the trench keeps going down past the limit of almost every machine humans have built. So the record is not a record. It is a note about how far we have gotten, and the ocean has been keeping score the entire time. Nobody knows the real number of wrecks, because nobody has counted the water. The rough estimate for shipwrecks lying on the seabed of this planet is around 3 million. 3 million ships, every one of them a crew, a cargo, a last morning. We have located maybe a few thousand. Sit with the shape of that. Almost everything is still out there. The Bronze Age crew who could steer by stars. The coal ships that vanished off Australia and turned up by accident in a search for something else. The galleons, the blockade runners, the mug on the deck, the car on the hangar floor, the pottery still bright after 5 centuries, sitting in the cold, in the dark, exactly where it landed, waiting for a light that has never come. Everything you have seen in this story came from a handful of expeditions poking at the largest thing on Earth with a flashlight. And the deep has been doing the one thing we cannot do. It has been holding on. It keeps a coffee cup for 80 years. It keeps a signature in a ship's glaze for 500. It keeps a jar of wine from a world with pharaohs in it. And it will keep our plastic bags long after every person alive today is gone. The Sammy B is down there right now, guns loaded, paint still on, in a spot on the chart that nobody will publish. She will still be there in 1,000 years, and the ocean will still be deeper than anything we have found in it.